The Adventures of Feluda by Satyajit Ray. The Mystery of the Walking Dead, Part 8. 5 minutes passed, but there was no sign of Tulshi Babu. Mr. Bhattacharya decided to get to work. Please place your hands, palm downward, on the table. Your little fingers should touch those of your neighbors. We placed our hands as instructed. A tapping noise started at once, caused by Lalmohan Babu's trembling fingers. He might have been playing a tabla. I saw him grit his teeth to steady his hands. Mr. Bhattacharya's eyes were closed, but his lips moved. He was reciting a Sanskrit shloka. A minute later he stopped. There was a deathly silence in the room. The lamp flickered. Around its flame 3 insects hovered. Our shadows, large and trembling, fell on the walls, nearly touching the ceiling. I gave Feluda a sidelong glance. His jaw was set and he was staring steadily at Mr. Bhattacharya with a totally expressionless face. Mr. Bhattacharya himself was sitting still as a statue. He had picked up the pencil, which was now poised over the blank sheet of paper. Then his lips started to tremble. Beads of perspiration broke out on his forehead. Lalmohan Babu began playing the tabla again, perfectly involuntarily. I could see why. The atmosphere in the room was decidedly eerie. My heart beat as fast as Lalmohan Babu's fingers shook. Jeevan Lal, Jeevan Lal, Jeevan Lal. Mr. Bhattacharya called softly. His lips barely moved. Are you there? Have you come? This time, to our amazement, the questions were spoken by a voice behind us. It was Nityanand. Now I realized what his role was. He spoke on behalf of his uncle. Perhaps Mr. Bhattacharya found it impossible to speak at a time like this. Yes, said Feluda. The word had been scribbled on the pad by Mr. Bhattacharya. His eyes were still closed. I watched his hands carefully. Where are you? Asked Nityanand. Here, very close, wrote Mr. Bhattacharya. Feluda read the words out. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Can you answer them? Yes. Who stole the money from your father's chest? I did. Did you see your murderer? Yes. Did you recognize him? Yes. Who was it? My father. But we didn't get to hear when the murder was committed, for Feluda stood up abruptly and said, That will do. Then he turned to me and said, Topshe, go and get that lantern from the passage outside. I can hardly see anything. Considerably startled, I got up and fetched the lantern. Feluda picked up the piece of paper Mr. Bhattacharya had scribbled on, ran his eyes over the few words written and said, Mr. Bhattacharya, your spirit may have left the earth, but it hasn't yet learned the truth. There are discrepancies in his answers. Mr. Bhattacharya glared at Feluda, looking as if he wanted to reduce him to a handful of dust. But Feluda remained quite unmoved. For instance, he continued, he is being asked who opened the chest and took the money. He says, I did, meaning Jeevan Lal. But that chest was empty, Mr. Bhattacharya. There was no money in it. As if by magic, the fury faded from Mr. Bhattacharya's face. He began to look rather uncertain. Feluda went on, I can say this with some confidence because it was not Jeevan Lal Malik who opened the chest, but Prodosh Mitra. Jeevan Lal helped me do it by opening the front door for me in the middle of the night and telling me where the key was kept. He also helped me to tie up his father and Bholanath Babu. Anyway, instead of any money, what we found in the chest was this. He slipped a hand into his pocket and brought out another piece of paper. The old Mr. Malik had refused to show it to me, but I needed it urgently as I had serious doubts about Mriganko Bhattacharya's intentions. My suspicions were aroused the minute I met him. He pretended to have guessed my name and profession by some supernatural means. The truth is that Tulshi Babu had already told him who I was and what I did. Am I right, Tulshi Babu? I realized with a start that Tulshi Babu had joined us, though I had not seen him arrived. He looked profoundly embarrassed and tried to explain, Yes, I'm afraid. You see, I wanted you to get a good impression, so Feluda raised a hand to stop him. I don't blame you, Tulshi Babu. You don't pretend to be something you are not. But this man does. Anyway, when I realized Mr. Bhattacharya was simply putting on an act to impress me, I was determined to get hold of the paper that Shyamlal Malik wanted no one to see. There were a few doubts in my mind about Shyamlal too, which I thought this piece of paper would help clarify. Mr. Bhattacharya was now sweating profusely. Feluda held the paper closer to the lamp and said Dullabh Singh's departed soul was supposed to have answered some questions. The questions were spoken, but it isn't difficult to guess what was asked. The written answers are good indicators. I shall now read out to you all the question and the answers given. If I get any of it wrong, I hope Mr. Bhattacharya will correct me. Mr. Bhattacharya was breathing so fast that the flame flickered strongly. Feluda began reading. The first question was, who is my enemy? Answer, he is in your house. Does he want me dead? No. Then what does he want? Money. How can I save my money from him? Don't keep it in your chest. Where should I keep it? Bury it under the ground. Where? In your garden. Where in the garden? At the far end under the last mango tree by the gap in the wall. Feluda put the paper back into his pocket. The traces of mud on his feet and the mosquito bites on his face had suggested that Shyamlal Malik had spent some time out in the garden. Now I know why he had done that. He simply followed the instructions Mr. Bhattacharya gave him, except that he thought they were given by his dead father. Mr. Bhattacharya knew about the money Shyamlal possessed and had been planning to steal it for quite some time, but he knew it was impossible as long as the old and trusted Bholanath remained with his master. At first he tried to poison Shyamlal's mind against Bholanath. Sadly, that did not work. Then miraculously, Mr. Bhattacharya found a new opportunity. Shyamlal himself called him to his house and asked him to contact a spirit. Mr. Bhattacharya seized this chance to kill two birds with one stone. He got Shyamlal to believe that someone in his own house had become his enemy, and he managed to get the money removed from the chest and placed at a spot which would be accessible to him. Shyamlal raised no objection to burying his money in the garden, for this was an ancient method of keeping things safe, which was perfectly acceptable to him, as Mr. Bhattacharya knew it would be. So he put everything in a separate box and buried it under the last mango tree. Yesterday, a sudden noise made him stop. Nityanand had suddenly sprung to his feet and leapt out of the door, but he could not get very far. A pair of strong arms caught him neatly and pushed him back into the room. Then their owner stepped in himself. It was Inspector Pramanik. "We found the box, Mr. Mitra," he said, with everything intact. He had hidden it under some clothes in an old trunk. "Constable?" A constable stepped forward and placed a fairly large steel box on the table. "Why, the lid's been broken," Feluda exclaimed. Then he lifted it. The box was crammed with bundles of 100-rupee notes. Never in my life had I seen so much cash. But what about the murder?" Mr. Bhattacharya cried desperately. "I did not kill Jeevan Lal." "No, I know you didn't," Feluda spoke scathingly. "I did. The murder was also my idea. What I did manage to kill and destroy, Mr. Bhattacharya, was your greed, your deception and your cunning. Your career in fraud is over, for everyone in this village will soon learn what you achieved today. Tell me, have you ever heard of anyone speaking to the soul of the living?" "Come in, Jeevan Babu." As a collective gasp went up, Jeevan Lal entered the room through the front door. A piercing scream tore through Mr. Bhattacharya's lips and he scrambled to his feet. The constable quickly put handcuffs on him. Inspector Pramanik had only one complaint to make. "Why did you make us dredge 2 lakes, Mr. Mitra? We wasted such a lot of time." No, please don't say that. It was necessary to pretend that Jeevan Lal had really been killed and that we were looking for his body. How else could we have exposed Bhattacharya so completely? It turned out that Feluda had planned the whole thing to the last detail. When he and I left the body and Bholanath and Lalmohan Babu went back to the house, Jeevan Lal had got up and slipped into an old storeroom in the house. His grandmother had seen him, but Feluda had managed to cover it up quickly. In the evening he had stolen out to make his way to Mr. Bhattacharya's house so that he could hide among the bushes and come out at the right time. But rather unfortunately, we were walking through the bamboo grove at the same time, which made him dive into the old temple and pretend to be a corpse once again. After dinner that night, Tulsi Babu came up to Feluda and said a little ruefully, "Are you cross with me, Mr. Mitra?" "Cross? Of course not. If anything, Tulsi Babu, I am most grateful to you. If you hadn't told that man my name, he wouldn't have dared to make up a puzzle about my initials, and I would have had no reason to wonder if his powers were genuine. You helped me a great deal." Jivanlal Malik turned up a few minutes later. "My father is speaking to me again," he said, beaming. "What did he say?" "When I went and touched his feet this evening, he spoke to me with an affection he hasn't shown for years. He even asked me how our business was doing and seemed really interested. I could scarcely believe it." Lalmohan Babu was busy dealing with the head of a fish. Now he finished chewing and opened his mouth. Then tomorrow?" he asked tentatively, looking at Tulsi Babu. "Oh yes, it's definitely going ahead. Everything's ready." "Very good. My speech is ready too. Felu Babu, will you please cast an eye over it?"